Okay, good morning all. I just want to introduce a few of the ladies here from Salix Funding. Let's talk about the decarbonisation of the public sector. So we've got Bea, Kira and Michelle. Cheers.
Thank you, Darren. Good morning, everyone. And today you've got myself, Michelle, and my colleague Kiara NB, who's our manager, and we will be speaking you through the insights and impacts of the public sector decarbonisation scheme at Salix. Yeah, just a brief intro. So before we just move on to our funded schemes, we're just going to take a moment to touch on why we are here. Our mission at Salix is to enable and inspire organisations to achieve net zero and create better places to live and work. The need to cut carbon emissions and slow the rate of climate change is more important now than ever. And our annual global reduction of 1.2 million tonnes of estimated carbon emissions saved is the equivalent of driving around the globe 21,000 times. So, who is Salix? Salix, we are a non-departmental public sector body, and we act as a delivery agent for the government funded schemes across England, Scotland and Wales. And on screen, you can see some of the schemes that we deliver on behalf of the Department for Energy and Security and Net Zero, the Welsh Government and also the Scottish Government. So today we will be focusing on PSDS, which is the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme. But before we just get into that, I just wanted to talk you through some of the schemes that we have on screen. So for example, we have the Low Carbon Skills Fund, which was first launched in 2020 and ran alongside PSDS for about 4 successful phases before funding for it was frozen. And LCSF helped especially smaller organisations with the planning and preparation for decarbonisation projects, which then allowed them to successfully apply and deliver PSDS projects. Due to time, we won't be able to speak about all of these schemes today, but if you head over to salixfinance.co.uk, I'm sure you'll be able to find as much interested as you would need. So yeah, as I said earlier, we'll be focusing on the public sector decarbonisation scheme today. And PSDS is the delivery of the low carbon heating projects within the public sector buildings. The purpose of PSDS is to provide grants for public sector organisations to install heat decarbonisation and energy efficiency measures. Grant funding is awarded for the replacement of an end-of-life fossil fuel heating system with a low carbon solution. The Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme, or PSDS, was launched in 2020 to support public sector organisations in England to install low carbon heating and energy efficiency measures in their estates. In total, over £3.5 billion has been issued through PSDS, and this is over 1,400 grants. Up to the end of 2027-28, we will be supporting the public sector to reduce their carbon emissions and reduce their energy bills. So since 2020, when we first launched, 1,221 projects have been awarded funding as part of PSDS Phase 1 through to Phase 3, totaling just under £3 billion of grant funding. To date, just over a third of these projects are still in the process of delivering or completing works with the help of our dedicated Salix relationship managers who meet with grant recipients on a monthly basis to discuss the delivery of the project. Successful projects from these phases are forecasted to reduce carbon emissions, by 438 kilotons of carbon per year, which is around 3,500 flights from London to New York, or the work of 20,000 trees. And now I'll be handing you over to my colleague Kiara.
So moving on to PSDS Phase 4, this was announced last summer. It launched in September and the project started in April and May this year. Overall, we had 231 projects, which totalled 725.8 million, which is estimated to save 145 kilotons of CO2 annually. Now on the screen you can see the NHS specific allocations. So we had 39 grant recipients, 2 of which were geothermal projects, and this came to a total of 407 million, so just over half of our allocations. PSDS Phase 4 did differ from previous phases. We listened to the feedback, we used our lessons learned, and we steered away from the first come, first served approach that we've had previously and prioritised cost-effective carbon savings. This had a positive reception, and we'll look into more of these changes in more detail a little bit later. We also started to support new technologies as part of PSDS Phase 4. We have 3 geothermal projects, 2 of which are NHS. We have the University Hospitals in Birmingham and the Countess of Chester. So moving on to a couple of case studies. First up we have Liverpool University Hospitals. This was a Phase 3A project and had a total value of £600,000. Now, this is a really key example of a whole building approach. It saved 85 tonnes of carbon and moved from gas to electricity. So the use of air source heat pumps minimised the use of gas boilers, which saved energy and carbon emissions and helped to improve local air quality. Switching to LED lighting saves money and energy and created brighter and more comfortable environments. The installation of solar PV meant that energy was supplied naturally, eliminating greenhouse gases from being emitted. And then the installation of loft insulation and double glazed windows helped to improve the energy efficiency of the building. So this is quite a good example of how decarbonising and improving energy efficiency not only works towards net zero, but also helps to improve the health and hospital environments. We now have one of our newer projects, which is a Phase 4, which I previously mentioned, the University Hospitals of Birmingham. This is the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and it's 1 out of 3 of our geothermal projects. So it's still in the early stages, and it's quite interesting as the major component is geothermal, which is quite unprecedented at Salix. It's a 3-year project, and due to the nature of this, they've had additional resources and support from us. The feasibility studies have recently been completed and have found that geothermal temperatures are actually lower than expected. So they've gone with a hybrid design and will be using waste heat from chillers connected to a water source heat pump. And this will increase the heat entering the system, improving the seasonal coefficient performance, and will lower the system's electrical energy consumption. And this will also help ensure that operational costs don't increase. I'll now hand over to Bea to talk through some common challenges.
Thank you. So as we've mentioned before, we've been delivering PSDS on behalf of DESNES for several years now. And as a result of that, that means we've been kind of working with these projects for many years and kind of seeing the common challenges and issues that they face during project delivery. So we thought it was a good opportunity just to discuss these here today. And obviously there are probably more challenges, but these are just the ones that come up again and again. So to begin with, timescales, and specifically timescales in conjunction with that grant funding. So PSDS grant funding is allocated on a yearly basis. So that means whilst you might have a total grant that is split throughout the years. So say it's £2 million total, you might have 1 million for year one and 1 million in year two. And it's quite strict that that funding needs to be incurred and claimed by Salix within that period. So for example, if you're not able to incur all that funding in your first year, you're unfortunately not able to kind of carry that over to your second year. And this is obviously difficult because with these projects there are often delays, and that can kind of have adverse impacts on drawing down that funding. Because if, say, you have delays at, say, board level, then that can mean it kind of pushes back designs and going out to tender, etc. And then you might not be in that position as you might have originally thought to be incurring some of that cost. And then due to that kind of tight grant funding, that means you might incur an underspend. So that obviously puts a lot of pressure on budgets, because kind of any underspend in that year will have to be kind of made up by that public sector body. And then a second common challenge that we have is to do with the distribution network operators, or the DNO, you might know them as, and upgrades and delays with this. So these projects change from gas to electricity, and in doing so that will increase electrical demand. And then that means you need to be in touch with your DNO that is responsible for the electricity grid in your area. So even if you do think that you have enough capacity on your site, we always say you still should reach out, because any changes to the electricity load could have kind of an impact on the local area. So one of the conditions that we often put on our PSDS projects is that engagement and that early engagement with the DNO. As kind of with everything, delays in DNO approval then can cause delays to timescales, which then has the impact on the funding. DNO delays can be up to 6 to 18 months. And I'll say we still do have PSDS phase 1 delivering, and a lot of that is to do with ongoing delays with the DNO. So definitely recommend getting in that early. Cost increases and inflation pressure, that obviously links in with timescales. But as I mentioned earlier, the grant funding is quite specific, and the grant funding can't be increased post-grant award. So whatever grant funding you've been issued in your grant offer letter, unfortunately, if you do encounter any cost increases, we're not in that position to be able to increase that funding. We often see post-tender is the most common time that there might be cost increases. Those increases come about, tenders come back and they're more than anticipated, and it's kind of puts grant recipients in the difficult position that they need to kind of try and find that funding from somewhere. Salix do try and provide help for this. We do have a change request process whereby if you are experiencing cost increases and are in the unfortunate position where you're not able to get any additional funding from your public sector body, you can apply for a change request, and that can be to de-scope a project. So maybe either removing a measure or removing a site to try and kind of reduce those costs. In the worst case scenario, projects have been in the position where they've had to abandon because of this. We always recommend that when applying for the projects, we kind of allow for some contingency, because I think these projects are not straightforward, and we do often see those increases. And finally, approvals. So approvals, kind of like DNO, is something we say engage early, identify what approvals are needed. So whether that's board approval, council meeting approval, or, for example, planning permission. These are vital, but also can be time-consuming. I know recently projects have had delays with the EA, so the Environmental Agency, if they're doing ground source heat pumps. So the sooner the better. Just to make sure that kind of these have as little impact as they can on projects, so that you're kind of not put up to those like time pressures with the timescales and the grant funding drawdown, because March is stressful enough without that. And then finally, the final slide. Unfortunately, we heard in the summer, and many of you will be aware, that DESNA's decided not to kind of invest any further funding into the PSDS grant scheme. other than what had already been previously allocated. So we thought it would be good to kind of take a moment in this last step to kind of look back on the PSDS scheme. And yeah, look at, we've been managing these projects for several years, and kind of we've been listening to kind of what works and what doesn't, taking lessons learned and trying to kind of implement that into kind of later schemes to try and make the scheme as good as possible. So here are a few of the changes that we've made from phase 1 back in 2020 to phase 4, which Chiara said was September last year, projects starting works in April. So firstly, the funding timescales. So from phase 3A, we gave clients the ability to apply for multi-year projects. So that could be single year, multi-year, or also planning year. So multi-year for 3A and phase 4 was you could have up to 3 years to deliver your project and get funding. 3B and 3C was only 2 years, but within that, it's kind of your choice on what works for your project. So larger NHS projects, which might be a bit more complex, you'd probably go for that multi-year. I think it would be pretty hard pressed to deliver some of those projects in a single year. But then for some of those smaller projects, we had that planning year option, which was great because it gave clients the opportunity to have a year with no pressure that they had to draw down funding, just to kind of plan if they hadn't had the time or resource to do that a bit sooner. Then also, as Chiara touched on earlier, we made changes to the allocation process. We heard the cries from everyone that they didn't enjoy the first come, first serve approach and logging on at 2 p.m. I did see somewhere that it was harder to get PSDS funding than Glastonbury tickets, and probably more stressful. But yeah, we moved to a targeted allocation approach, which, yeah, kind of gave clients or grant recipients more of an option of kind of had several months to kind of perfect that application, and it wasn't just kind of random. So that was good. And then also we've made changes to the eligibility criteria throughout the years. So when we introduced PSDS, we wanted to kickstart heat decarbonisation, as we'd previously been administering loans, but with heat decarbonisation, it comes at a higher cost, so it wasn't always possible to kind of do that through loans because the payback was way too many years. So phase 1 obviously was the kickstart to that, but actually there was no mandation on having a low carbon heating system. However, from phase 2, the criteria got stricter and all projects had to have a low carbon heating system and also remove a end-of-life fossil fuel boiler. Also, eligibility criteria changed, as we said, with phase 4, with the targeted allocation. The grant carbon cost became more important, and that also increased to £510 per carbon tonne. And then finally, we also were able to, through the years, kind of introduce different eligible technologies. So, for example, phase 4 swimming pool covers were eligible, which is cool. And also, as Chiara mentioned, we also were able to fund 3 geothermal projects. And yeah. So thanks everyone for listening. We hope you are able to see kind of the work we do at Salix, have an insight into some of the projects and also kind of how we've been adapting the schemes over the years to try kind of make them the best possible. We're obviously happy to take any questions, but we'll also be around all day, so grab us if you have any project-specific queries or anything like that. Cheers, thank you.
When you talk about delays on schemes, what might cause problems being drawdown from the what help can you offer? Because sometimes there are unavoidable delays.
Yeah.
They're very understandable, but places you're in a difficult place, but the trust in a difficult place as well. So what sort of flexibility can there be?
Yeah, it comes up time and time again. I think it's probably the most commonly asked question is if we can shift any grant funding, and we have gone and asked if there's any possible way that we could kind of not be so strict, and we always get the same answer that it's kind of department rules. But so on that basis, we have we've taken it into account with payments. So normally funding's drawn down kind of once the costs have been incurred, but we do say like for orders placed, you can place these orders in advance of kind of then coming to site. So advance order placement, as long as you can prove it's been ordered, is a way that we try and like encourage people, like if you've got your designs, like those can be high cost items and can kind of help try and like spend some of that funding ahead of kind of you getting that. So we always encourage that. Also DNO, we know that you get your quote ahead, so we can pay that in advance. So, and I know we're like in conversations because we've got a lot of heat network projects at the moment, and that's all different. So we are like going to DESNES and saying this is how it common works, like can we like, how do we do payments with that? So we are constantly trying to work out ways to help clients, but it's not easy when we're just not at the end of the day allowed to shift it. But we'll see. We've got no more funding, maybe that would be nicer to us.
Any more questions at all? Very good. No? Good. Thank you very much, and again, thanks very much. Cheers. Thank you.